You're on mute, Christian.
Hello and welcome to the Citizens Assembly Working Group Training Webinar from Extinction Rebellion Live. Tonight we're talking about learning from past citizens' assemblies and other deliberative mini-publics. Apologise for the late running for the scheduled start of this live. The whole internet just decided to break. But we're ready now. We're going over to Marine to lead you in this amazing webinar. Thanks for tuning in.
Hello, welcome everybody. Welcome to the Citizens Assembly Working Group webinar series. Yeah, it's all, well, I'm so pleased so many of you are here. Lots of you here on Zoom with us, and I know people are joining us on the live stream on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and all these amazing platforms. So yeah, it's really, really exciting, and thank you for joining us. My name is Marine. I'm from the Citizens Assembly Working Group, and I am joined by Jess and Rianka from XR Youth, who will be questioning our panelists later. So thank you girls so much for being here. This is really, really brilliant to have you supporting our working group like this. And then we have our guests. So we've got Clodagh Harris, and we've got Graham Smith with us, and both of them are experts in deliberative democracy. And deliberative democracy is basically a way of saying it's a kind of democracy that we use where we actually talk to each other rather than shout at each other, and listen to each other and learn together, and generally just feels like a bit more of a constructive way of conducting democracy. But they are going to explain exactly what it is. And what's so exciting for us this evening is that they are going to tell us about citizens' assemblies that have already happened in the world, and how some of them were successful, some of the lessons that we have learned, so that we can start thinking about citizens' assemblies in a less abstract way, but that it becomes a real thing that real people are already doing all over the world. And yeah, we're just really curious to find out more. So I'm going to hand over to Clodagh. I think you wanted to start, right? Yes, great. So I'll let you take it from here.
Yep. Perfect. Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for the opportunity to participate this evening. It's a great pleasure. If I wasn't doing this, I'd no doubt be watching CBeebies. So this is a very, very pleasant distraction, and real pleasure to hear everybody else's contributions as well. What I'd like to do really is discuss some of the learnings we've had from the Irish perspective, from the Irish Citizens' Assemblies. So we're currently on our third Citizens' Assembly. It's, I suppose, stopped its proceedings currently because of the COVID-19 pandemic. But I'll share a little bit about the successes and the challenges, and I look forward to the questions and the comments. So I'll start maybe without going into any great detail on any one Citizens' Assembly, but to give you a broad brushstroke overview of what's worked well and what hasn't, or what could be improved. So I suppose in the Irish context, one of the things we have I suppose learned, looking at the first slide there on successes, is that we have learned from citizens' assemblies, as you were saying, Marine, it's a different way of doing democracy. People come together, have different perspectives, different viewpoints. Christian, would you mind moving to the first slide, please? Thank you. So we've brought people from all walks of life into rooms over a series of weekends in which they have listened to experts, listened to personal testimonials, listened to advocacy and civil society groups on a variety of issues. But what we have noticed is that they have been particularly successful in an Irish context at addressing contentious issues. And when I talk here about contentious issues, I suppose two of the successful referendums come to mind, one of them on marriage equality and the other one on the provision of abortion in our constitution. So previously it had been felt maybe that citizens' assemblies and this type of approach was best used for dry technical issues, But we have noticed anyway in the Irish cases, and indeed I'm sure we will see so elsewhere too, that they can be used for difficult and sensitive issues. So there too, that's one of the points. We've also looked at the issue of climate change and climate action, which again, I suppose is quite an intractable issue. And I can talk a little bit more about that as I go through the points. The citizens' assemblies, as I said, we're on our third citizens' assembly with the promise of a fourth one. And indeed, we are currently without a government. We have a caretaker government. We had an election on the 8th of February of this year, and we have yet to establish a government as a consequence of that election. But the parties that are in negotiation currently have promised another citizens' assembly, so a fifth citizens' assembly on eco-diversity. So they've become pretty much a common feature of the political landscape, and that's only in the last 7 to 8 years, which in a political sense is phenomenally rapid. So how have they contributed, I suppose, to Irish political life and indeed Irish democracy? Well, they've done so in 3 ways. I suppose firstly, they've done it through input. So as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, the whole premise behind citizens' assemblies is that you have a cross-section of society, you have a diverse membership. In the Irish case, the members, there've been 100 members, so 99 of those have been citizens that have been randomly selected with an eye to gender, age, region, educational qualification, etc. But it's not just the diversity that is found there in the actual membership, but also in the form of expertise that has been presented and indeed the perspectives. We haven't in the Irish case stratified or chosen people according to their political attitude on a topic, which is something that has been done in the UK and in France and elsewhere. So throughput legitimacy, again, this is through the deliberative process. So they have enhanced decision-making and enhanced democracy by what Marijn was saying at the beginning, through respectful engagement, through giving reasons, listening to the viewpoints of others, considering their own viewpoints. And the research that has been done on the assembly, on the assemblies to date, shows that the members have valued that, and they have felt that it has given them an opportunity to contribute their informed opinion on matters, and they have felt that they have been listened to respectfully. Then I suppose where some of its greatest successes really have been in terms of what it has achieved. So we have had 3 successful referendums. So there have been 4 referendums in total, 3 of them were passed. Just to give you background, the reason there were referendums is that in the Irish context, our constitution can only be changed through a popular referendum. So and the reasons that referendums were held were that 4 of the matters required changes to our constitution. So marriage equality required a change to our constitution. That is why it went to a referendum. Similarly, the provisions around the legal provision, of abortion, that had to go to referendum as well if it was going to be changed. And likewise, there was a referendum on blasphemy, on amending that law, and indeed another one on the age at which you could run for the office of the president. That one was not passed. What's I think interesting as well is we're beginning to see that it's having policy impact. So it's in terms of the Irish assemblies, they're best known for their referendums on kind of on moral issues, on social and moral issues. But we're beginning to see impact at the policy level, which I think is exciting, and that's slower. And that's where we've seen that really is on the climate action side. The last assembly, the one that ran from 2016 to 2018, one of the topics it was charged with discussing was climate action, how Ireland could become a leader in tackling climate change, which was quite an ambitious remit considering we're a laggard in the European sense. And unfortunately, only 2 weekends were allocated to its deliberations, but nonetheless, the Assembly came to 13 quite ambitious and quite, I suppose, far-reaching recommendations. They were in turn discussed in a joint parliamentary committee that was specifically set up to discuss those recommendations. And those recommendations made it into the all government climate action plan. So we began to see very specific, I suppose, impact there. Now, unfortunately, before the adaptation and the mitigation procedures that were outlined in those documents, and indeed the governance procedures that would have strengthened the role for oversight on policy and the greening of policy across government. Unfortunately, before the legislation that would underpin them could come into effect or could be passed, our parliament was dissolved. We were due an election, so it remains to be seen what's going to happen with the next government, which moves me on to my final point on this slide, is that how will we see that this can move beyond electoral cycles? Because I suppose deliberative and participatory forms of government are very much beholden to whomever are in government at the moment in terms of achieving impact and effect. And it would be interesting to see if these processes and the outcomes from the last assembly, particularly in climate action, will continue to be kind of taken up by new government. My sense is that they will, because the parliamentary committee was an all-party parliamentary committee and it overwhelmingly endorsed the Citizens' Assembly's recommendations. But I suppose we are now entering into a new economic climate post-COVID-19, and it is to be hoped that the commitments that were made will be honoured. Okay, so there are the successes. So moving on to the challenges, and I'll go through these quickly. Firstly, in the Irish context, yes, there have been huge successes. I mean, we have seen much stronger citizen input. We haven't seen acceptance of the model, a model that was initially viewed with skepticism by some within the media and also some within civil society. We now see these same groups calling for citizens' assemblies on certain topics. So that's a very positive development. I suppose there are some challenges. Firstly, it is still an ad hoc process. It still relies on the political system or the political establishment to set it up, to initiate it. So they're very much initiated by the governments of the day through parliamentary resolution. Also, so challenges the Irish system has faced. So excuse me, I'm smiling because I feel I have a 4-year-old about to join my presentation. The number in the Irish context, the assemblies, the first 2 assemblies that were set up were given quite a diverse and eclectic range of topics to address over a short period of time. So, for example, the Convention on the Constitution was asked to address topics as diverse as reducing the voting age, introducing marriage equality, reviewing and reforming the electoral system, and plus 5 other topics in a 12 to 13 month period. That presents huge pressures on the members and on those who are organising, I suppose, and supporting or organising the events, and also those supporting it. And an example of that is, again, the recent one on where they discussed that the one assembly from 2016 to 2018, those 100 members discussed the provision of the legal provision of abortion in the Irish Constitution, and they also discussed climate action. They discussed fixed term parliaments, how we conduct referendums, and how we should deal as a society with an ever-aging population. I mean, incredibly diverse range of topics, and only 2 weekends allocated to climate action. Which, you know, even with the best of intentions, was quite an ask of a group of people. In terms of recruitment, it's done through what is usually the case with citizens' assemblies, as I mentioned earlier, random selection stratified according to gender, region, educational qualifications, socioeconomic status, etc. In the Irish context, we have not to date recruited according to political attitudes. So, for example, I know our attitudes on the topic that is being discussed. So, for example, I know in the UK, in the current Citizens' Assembly, they do know people's stance on climate change. And similarly in France. Also in the Irish context, we haven't targeted particular groups. So, for example, what I mean by that is that there is always the concern that some groups who tend to under-participate will still under-participate in this process. And that I suppose, is contrary to the inclusion principles that underpin these processes. So I was very interested to see that in the French case, they actually have specifically worked with an NGO to include team members from a very, I suppose, from very difficult backgrounds, difficult settings, and that NGO is working with those members as has selected them and is working with them as they proceed through their deliberations. Attendance has been an issue in the Irish Assembly as well. And I suppose that's another challenge. I know in the last Assembly, I think on the first weekend, something like 75 or 76 people of the 100 showed up, and a similar figure was the case. That was the case for the final meeting as well. Agenda control, again, in the Irish context, and it would seem to be the case to date in other assemblies as well, internationally, is that the agenda is very much set for the Assembly. There might be some leeway for the Assembly to maybe go on a little bit of a tangent on a given topic, but by and large, the agenda is set by the government or the Parliament or those who initiate the Assembly. And that, I suppose, raises questions around empowerment and control. Likewise, the government responsiveness has been, yes, there has been strong response of, the government has responded to certain reports and to certain recommendations, usually positively, but we also have had experiences where reports have been ignored. For example, the third, fourth and fifth reports of the Assembly that concluded its work in 2018, they have not received official government response yet. And that brings me, I suppose, to my final point in terms of once a given Assembly concludes its work, that's it. There's no ongoing monitoring. So the monitoring can happen from those of us who have an interest in it, those of us who are in civil society, academia, the media, etc. But the members themselves do not have a formal monitoring role, or the Assembly itself concludes its work. The chair will present, as was the case with the last Assembly, the chair will present to the relevant parliamentary committee, subcommittee, but then then it comes to an end. And then if there's another Assembly takes place, it will take place usually a year or two later with a different secretariat, a different chair, and there's no necessary, obviously there's shared expertise in terms of running an organisation of these processes, but no follow-up in terms of monitoring of the previous Assembly's outcomes. So that's a short I suppose that's a shortcoming. And again, if the whole purpose of these assemblies is to empower, then they themselves need to be more empowered, I would argue, particularly in terms of agenda control and monitoring powers. So I will stop there. I think I've managed roughly to stay within 10 minutes, roughly. Thank you for your patience.
No, that was so interesting, Clodagh. Thank you so much. I've just been scribbling away, and I can see the questions coming in on Zoom. I just wanted to say to everybody watching us on the live stream, please do put your questions and comments in the comments section in the live stream. We've got our incredible team of Citizens Assembly working group members behind the scenes collating all your questions. So we will try and get to your questions after the presentations and after XR Youth have had a chance to question the two experts as well. So Clodagh, thank you so much. And Graham, let's go over to you now.
Okay, thanks. So what timing? My wife just bought a piece of cake for me to eat, but clearly that's not going to happen. Can you put the slides up? Thank you. If you could, so that's who I am. If you need to get in touch with me, there's my email address. But you want to go on to the first slide? Second slide, thanks. So Clodagh was telling us about what's often thought of as the poster case of citizens' assemblies, which is the Irish Citizens' Assembly. And in many ways, the Irish Citizens' Assembly has been groundbreaking. It's been very influential in terms of thinking through the way that citizens' assemblies can work, particularly at the national level, particularly on controversial political and constitutional issues. And people's knowledge of citizens' assemblies often only goes back as far as the Irish Assembly. And occasionally people will know a bit about the British Columbia Citizens' Assembly on electoral reform that happened before that. But I think it's really important for us to recognise that there's actually half a century, 50 years, and makes me sound old, but 50 years of practice, which we can draw on here, because citizens' assemblies are, if you like, the peak of a family of deliberative processes that share two characteristics. One is that they bring together participants through random selection. And the second is that they are facilitated, those participants are then facilitated to deliberate, typically by being given input from various witnesses, whether they be technical experts, whether they be people who are advocating a particular position, or whether they be people with lived experience. Those participants then get to deliberate and come to recommendations. And this, we can go all the way back to the 1970s in the United States, where citizens' juries emerged, and also from planning cells in Germany with the same kind of time. And then about a decade later, consensus conferences in Denmark. Another decade later, deliberative polls from Jim Fishkin, which he's run all over the world. And then we saw the emergence of citizens' assemblies in the 2000s, and then also the emergence of even larger organizations like the G1000 in Belgium. And the reason I want to kind of say that we should be alive to these different bodies is because they've actually shown us that you can deal with incredibly complex and controversial issues through these sorts of deliberative mini publics, through these different ways of randomly selecting and engaging citizens. So we're all familiar now with the kinds of the Climate Change Assembly, the one in the two weekends in Ireland, but the UK Climate Assembly, the convention that's going on in France. But other processes have also dealt with urban policy, with transport planning, with really highly scientific and technical issues like genetic modification and genetic engineering, all sorts of aspects of environmental pollution, and issues such as the use of transgenic animals in research. So what we know from this sort of half a decade of practice and the research that's followed it is that citizens are willing and able to deal with incredibly complex issues. The question is, are politicians willing to listen to them? Can I have the next slide, please? So these are the, I've just given you one of my lessons here, but the lessons I want to draw from this almost 50 years of practice is that stratified random selection works, and it works in two ways. One way it works is it brings together, possibly I would argue, the most diverse body of citizens that you'll see in any political institution. There are issues, and we may want to talk about this during the discussion. I still think it's hard for the most marginalized to engage, and it's really interesting that as Clodagh mentioned, in France, they've ensured that homeless people can be part of the assembly by giving them significant support. But however we play this, these are the most diverse body, the most diverse political institutions that we have seen, I think, within contemporary democracies. The second is random selection has really worked as a way of protecting against social and economic power. Those people who are most influential within society cannot get a shortcut into the assembly. There is no way for a particular interest group to pack the assembly. This is so these assemblies are of ordinary, everyday citizens who are brought together without the kinds of political agendas that people typically bring into a political institution. The second thing we've learned from these processes is that the formal invitation to participate, the lottery, you are special, you have been chosen, actually really does generate buy-in from citizens. And I think the most impressive one is probably the first Citizens' Assembly in British Columbia, which over 1 year met for over 12 weekends to talk about the incredibly dry topic of a new electoral system. And of the 100 citizens who started, 99 finished. The only person who didn't come was because they had really significant family illness during the process. So the retention is actually is incredibly impressive. Probably actually the Irish Assembly, and we can talk about this perhaps later, was had more drop off of people. And partly I think that's because they didn't pay an honorarium. They didn't pay their citizens to actually participate, but there might be other reasons as well, which we could look at. But what's clear is that citizens love doing this. When they walk into the room, they're often skeptical about they can make any contribution at all, but actually the process brings them in and it keeps them in. The third thing, which we've got plenty of evidence to show, is that the facilitation really does reduce domination by the most politically confident. If you can imagine a room that was not facilitated, it would be those people who are most confident, those who had the most political interest, who would really lead the discussions. Well, through facilitation, we can manage that process to ensure that those people who are less confident, those people who feel more marginalized, actually have an equal voice. And I was one of the organisers of the Citizens' Assembly on Brexit, and we were really delighted to find that there was no statistical difference between any of the social groups in terms of the times of their speaking in the assembly, whether it was on gender, social class, ethnicity, geography. None of that mattered. There was a real sense of equality across the assembly. I've already mentioned, and I think my slide before showed, that citizens have shown that they are willing and able to come to recommendations on highly complex and highly controversial political issues. We have examples where recommendations have broken political deadlocks, and I think the Irish Citizens' Assembly is one example where, and again, Clodagh can tell us much more, but the political elite found it really hard to deal with the question of abortion. They found it really hard to deal with the question of same-sex marriage. And actually the role of the assembly and the convention that preceded it really helped break that sort of political and social deadlock around that particular issue. And it's hard to think of another way of doing that. And there are other examples that we can point to. However, and I think we can also go back to the example that Clodagh gave, but in no way is this an issue that just relates to the climate assembly, the assembly in Ireland, is that there is selective listening. There is cherry picking of recommendations. And no one's done a systematic study of this, but I think we've got enough evidence to show that governments do, if they are given the room and the room to maneuver, will select those proposals that are easier to implement than those that are more challenging. And so that kind of leaves Extinction Rebellion with a particular issue, a particular problem, which is how to ensure that assemblies are empowered. And I just want to leave you with a couple of interesting developments globally in relation to this. And these were 2 points that Clodagh brought out in her last slide. How do we ensure that citizens are actually able to have some control over the agenda? How can we ensure that the recommendations of citizens are actually taken up by public authorities? Well, in Belgium, in a small region of the German-speaking region of Belgium, they now have established a citizens' council, which is a permanent randomly selected body, which decides what issues that the Parliament will run a citizens' assembly on. It's not the parliamentarians, it's not the government, it's not civil society organisations. They can all make representations, but it's a randomly selected body of citizens who decide what the focus of a citizens' assembly should be. And at the other end, we find the question of how do we ensure that recommendations are adopted? Well, in Poland, in the municipal citizens' assemblies that have happened there, they've managed to get agreement that the mayor will adopt any recommendation that achieves 80% support within the assembly. So before the assembly starts, the mayor agrees and commits to implementing any of the recommendations that achieve that 80% threshold. Anything below that, then the mayor has some discretion, but if it gets a supermajority support, then that becomes a local policy. So I think that the evidence that we've got and the lessons we can learn from citizens' assemblies are that they do work. and they work incredibly well. They're a really impressive way of bringing public judgments, the judgment of ordinary citizens, into the political process. And there are ways of managing these problems of selective listening, of cherry picking, of agenda setting. And a lot of this is to do with careful design and the political willingness of politicians to accept that these are legitimate democratic institutions. I'll leave it there. Thank you. I'm not sure what's happening. Christian, are you taking us back? I seem to still be the only person who's actually who's actually speaking at the moment. Marine? Oh dear, we got a collapse of the looks like we've got a collapse of the system. Clodagh, can you unmute yourself or not?
Hi, Graham. Yeah, sorry. It looks like the system has gone. Well, so we've lost some people.
What we can't tell is whether or not anybody else in the system is there. Jess, Bianca, are you still there? Can you wave? Yes, you are there. You are there. That's fantastic.
Is Christian there? Did I see Christian? One moment.
Okay. What's not clear is whether or not we've actually we're still.
There's Kathy.
Yeah, I can't. Can I talk? Are you
yes,
here?
we can.
Yes, yeah, can you
Right. Okay. Well, let's carry on. If I'm here, I won't be anywhere near as good as Ryan, but never mind. Thank you both. That was great. It was really interesting to see how successful it is and to know that we need to carry on pushing for a national citizens' assembly on climate and ecological justice, because the one that's currently ending, it's near the end, isn't anywhere near the quality of a citizens' assembly that Extinction Rebellion want, and that we feel will actually bring about real change. But I would really want to ask if we can have some questions to Clodagh and Graham from Rianka and Jess. Who wants to start? Rianka? Jess? Rianka?
Yeah, I'll start,
okay.
Yeah. Okay. So obviously it's a fact that we have an aging population, and a citizens' assembly would be a sortition to accumulate a group of people who represent our population. But my question is, how will the opinions of the youth be prioritised, seeing as we are the ones who will live to see the effects of a climate catastrophe?
Graham, do you want to go? Do you want to have a shot at that?
Ah, right. Very, very cool question, Rianka. So there's a couple of ways we can think about this. And I guess there's a conservative way, or a sort of, not conservative as in with Conservative Party, but a sort of a conservative in the sense of not rocking the boat too much way, and a more radical way. The first way would be to say what we need to do is to make sure that we get young people organised beforehand, that we do widespread consultation and engagement with young people, such that the perspective of young people can be presented in a concerted manner to those people who are selected on the assembly. So the first way of doing that is to ensure that young people get to frame debates, that they get to present to the assembly. So you may quite reasonably be worried at that point and say, actually, we, still not convinced that young people will be heard and their views taken seriously. It's a political decision, but you can actually oversample young people and say that there will be more young people in this assembly. that would be a political decision. And I'm not quite sure why Jess is on live streaming. It's not following the person, but that's fine. It's a very cool guitar, Jess. So I'm quite happy to speak to the guitar. So so it's a political decision. It could be a political decision to say, as you've just said, look, young people are going to have to deal with this problem. Let's oversample young people and have more younger people within the assembly. So I think you've got those two options, and they combine. One is to make sure that systematic evidence is provided. And second is the option of more radically oversampling young people. Clodagh.
Okay, no, it's an excellent question. And I'm even thinking, like, even when you think about it, it's obviously young people, but what about those who aren't even born yet? So I suppose what occurs to me, and I agree with what Graham is saying, you know, the systematic evidence and then through oversampling. Another way of doing it is as the assembly itself as a group, maybe in its first session when it sits down and decides its kind of, in some ways decides its approach and the values that it might want to bring with it, the normative dimension of its work. It might decide to consider having intergenerational solidarity as part of the lens through which it examines its work and makes its recommendations. And I think that's one way in which you could perhaps square that circle in a way, or, you know, deal with the issue is maybe, and this isn't something that has, I know that in the Irish context, what has happened from day one with the convention, which was the initial assembly, and that was mixed group of people. It was 33 representatives, political representatives, and 66 citizens. But from the beginning, the chair did set out kind of the way in which the underlying principles, almost like the rules of engagement, that, you know, that there would be collegiality, fairness, equality of voice, etc. And I think the more I think about assemblies and how they operate, and as Graham spoke in his presentation about the need for good design, I think for something like a citizens' assembly on something like climate action, where really you're looking for decisions to be very future regarding, then there's an argument to be made for having that discussion day one about, you know, how should we frame our recommendations, what should inform our recommendations, and maybe that idea of intergenerational solidarity and thinking of those that have yet to be born. Yeah.
So just one other thing, there's an interesting development in Japan called the future design movement, which doesn't deal with the young people issues per se, but they split the assembly in half, and half of the people have to say imagine themselves to be living in 50 years time. Right. And they think about the issue from what they think it would be like to live in 50 years time, and the other half of the assembly do it in current time, and then they come together at some point and then try and accommodate these kind of 2050 views with the 2070 view, I guess, would be with the 2020 view. So that's another way that there's all sorts of creative design ways you can do it. Rianka, what do you think should be done?
Yeah, I agree with both of your points. I think that kind of the oversampling of young people would be the answer personally.
Cool.
Right, Jess, do you want to have a go at these two? Give them tricky to get their brains going. How are we going to get around this one?
I think my question would be, how would one seek to or go about empowering marginalised and often sort of disempowered and disenfranchised groups to participate in it, rather than sort of your stereotypical middle class people who, yeah, so how would you do that?
Do you want to lead on that one, Clodagh?
Thank you. Yeah, no, that's an excellent question, Jess, and I wish I had the answer, a full answer. Certainly, that's huge. That lies at the heart, really, of any kind of deliberative process. For me, that inclusion is huge. Is its greatest, I suppose, is potentially its greatest strength, but also one of the greatest challenges. And there is always the concern that there is an element of self-selection. And yes, people are, as Graham mentioned, those who are invited to participate feel it a huge honour. And the beauty of the Irish processes and all these processes is that when people come together in the room and engage collegially in small group discussions, where you're from and your background tends to completely disappear. But that's when they're in the room. The challenge is getting people into the room day one. And I know that there have been different approaches to this. So in France, they have endeavoured to do this through working with the homeless. The homelessness NGO, and likewise they tried to do that in Belgium with the G1000. They worked with groups on the ground to try and bring in newly arrived migrants and indeed people who are homeless, to bring people into the processes. I know other ways that it could be done is through the payment of honoraria, so the payment of small fee to recognise the work that is being done and making it feasible for people perhaps to give up precarious employment or precarious hours of work to participate, because it's a lot. We're asking a lot of people to give it sometimes between 6 and 8 weekends of their lives to this. And again, the nature of employment has changed so much. And again, it's an issue for younger people too, because employment has become more precarious. And unfortunately, it seems to be targeting younger people more than older people. So, so again, I suppose there are it would require very careful design. It has to be, I suppose, done in ways that are not tokenistic, so that it can't just be one person from a certain group and a group of 150, because it would be hard to feel that you had voice if you were the only voice of that cohort or that ethnic background, etc. I'd be interested to hear your own views on this, Jess, after maybe we hear Graham's views first, but it is without a doubt a challenge. It is, yeah.
So let's be, I mean, what Jess is saying here is really critical. So let's be clear that when we open up participation without being careful about selection, then it's older, white, male, middle class people who look a bit like me who participate most. And that's one of the reasons why citizens' assemblies and other deliberative processes use sortition. And one of the what sortition enables you to do is to make sure that the people in the assembly look like the wider population in terms of gender, in terms of age, in terms of social class, and in terms of geography and whatever criteria you use. So sortition is already an improvement on what we've had before. I still have some concerns that the most marginalized don't engage. And one way that you can try to improve that is by ensuring you send more invitations to people from those particular groups. But I think some of the most exciting work I've seen is actually where you see people actually going into those kinds of into those neighborhoods, the more marginalized people, and actually working with people and sort of talking to them about the assembly, doing more work, recognizing that to get certain types of people into the assembly, you have to do more work. If you think that one of the first time you hear about an assembly is when you get an official letter through the post saying, are you interested in participating? And from those people who say yes, you get your sample. Well, the people who respond, there are certain groups of people who will not respond to official letters. And we're going to have to use different ways of engaging those sorts of people. So I think, Jess, it is a weakness, but citizens' assemblies are way much better than the kinds of a lot of the traditional ways of engagement. But I think we have to do more work on that. So what are your thoughts?
I think personally for me, just the worry was that it would be a similar situation to sort of voting, where people have that right, but they don't exercise that right. But I do agree that a citizens' assembly would be the better option. And I think maybe it's about reaching out to those communities and asking them why they feel sort of disempowered and why they wouldn't want to participate. But I do agree that sort of once they're given the opportunity, they're much more likely to exercise that right.
So in the assemblies that I've looked at, that you can make sure that, you know, poorer communities are represented to the degree that they're represented within society. though groups, people from ethnic minorities are part, and you make sure that you have a group of people who look like the broader population, but you have to do a lot of work to get that to happen. It doesn't happen, inverted commas, naturally, because for a lot of these people, they're very suspicious, or they don't necessarily have the same kind of time. So for a good assembly, the most important bit of work is actually the recruitment. We once we got people in the room, we kind of, you know, that we know what to do. Getting people in the room, you have to, that's where you have to put most of your effort. Cool question. Thanks, Jess.
Very good question, Jess. Sorry, am I on?
No, Maureen's better back, I think.
Oh, is she? Oh, right. Well, I'll
Yeah.
just finish this before I pass back to Rianka's going to ask the next question. But I just wanted to say that in France, for the French Convention, they actually didn't use postal. They used telephone. They rang people. And I think, you know, I think a lot of people think, oh God, I couldn't do that. It's it's going to be too difficult. I won't understand it. But it's really about the communication and the talking to people. And I think during the whole process, everything has to be explained so people understand in plain English, not sort of too technical. Right, Rianka, if you'd like to ask your next question, and then Marine will take over and I'll sort of melt into the background again.
Okay, my next question kind of follows on from the point that was just made. People in so-called less developed countries are statistically more affected by the climate crisis, therefore are forced to immigrate to the West, sometimes illegally. How will these voices be uplifted without threat to their immigration status?
Boom. That's a good question. I said, yeah. I don't think we have an answer to that, Rianka, at the moment. I think it's a weak spot of citizens' assemblies. I mean, first of all, the phrase citizens' assemblies is a mistake, because usually they're residents' assemblies, people who are living in the particular. No, it's my fault, not yours. Don't nothing to do with you. You didn't name it, but even with it, but within that, there will be certain residents who just won't be willing to put themselves forward because they shouldn't be, in inverted commas, shouldn't be in the country in the first place, don't have the legal right to be in the country. And I just don't, unless we see a significant change in the law, I can't see that changing. We've got to remember, citizens' assemblies, we can't expect citizens' assemblies to solve all of society's problems. And if one of society's problems is that there are people in this country who are climate refugees, or who are here because you know, there is war in their country, and yet we don't give them legal status, that's not something we're going to solve through the recruitment of a citizens' assembly. So I think one of the dangers is that we think citizens' assemblies are the answer. Not you, but we, people like me, think citizens' assemblies are the answer to everything. There's a whole bunch of political issues which we have to deal with to ensure that these are free and fair processes, and that goes beyond how we organise a citizens' assembly. It goes on to our question of who has the right to be in our country, who has the right to speak.
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and it occurs to me that even in the Irish context, you can only be part of the citizens' assemblies if you have the right to vote in a referendum, which means you're either an Irish citizen or a citizen of the UK. So it doesn't even extend to residents. I think it's a brilliant question, Rianka, and I think one of the challenges, I suppose, how you can bring these voices in directly, I don't think that requires more work, but indirectly, if I can give an example, in the Irish case, when we were discussing the provision of abortion, there were people who obviously had direct experience over 50, 40, 60, 10, 5 years of having to travel abroad for abortions. And what was done was there was a sociologist who was commissioned to gather people's personal stories of why they had done what they had done, how they had responded to a crisis pregnancy, whether or not they had terminated a crisis pregnancy. So it was important, I suppose, to have a balance of stories, of balance of experiences. But what it did do, it did give voice to, I suppose, the lived experience of a crisis pregnancy. and all the challenges that such pregnancies can bring to people. And it brought those stories, I suppose, it brought the lived experience of that legal provision, or that constitutional restraint. It brought the lived experience of that to the members of the Assembly. Now, for all we know, members of the Assembly themselves may have had terminations or have considered it at some stages in their lives, we don't know. But what it did do was it brought in a degree of expertise and a voice that wasn't necessarily there on the panels, or that wasn't specifically recruited for amongst the membership. So that's one way of doing it indirectly, is to make sure that those who might not come forward and speak because of fears for their status, that their voices could nonetheless be captured and their concerns and their views shared legitimately, I suppose, and those perspectives taken into consideration by the members themselves, because the weekend that those personal stories were shared was a very harrowing weekend for the members of the Assembly, and those stories would, no doubt, I'm sure, have impacted upon their recommendations.
And Clodagh, there's a bigger issue here, which Rianka is pointing to in some ways, which is we're still only including those people who happen to be in the United Kingdom or in Ireland. One thing we know about climate change is that the actions of UK climate policy will have significant impact beyond our borders. So that's another limit of the Citizens' Assembly model, which is it's only those people who are given, who happen to be within a particular geographical border, who get to make decisions that actually have impacts on people's lives well beyond those borders. Now, we are, inverted commas, the victims of the existing state relations. But actually, if you were building this from the bottom up, you'd say, actually, all those affected by the decision should be part of that assembly. But of course, that becomes incredibly complicated geopolitically.
Yeah, very. But no, it's absolutely true. Yeah. What's your own sense, Rianka?
Yeah, I completely agree that obviously in the West, we are the ones perpetuating the crisis onto the people who are experiencing it right now. Yeah, it's a lot to try and think about. Like Graham said, it's a kind of a geopolitical mess if we were to try and put everything into one box, if that makes sense, to try and survey everyone, but that would be really important as well.
Thanks for the cool question, Rianka.
Jess or Rianka, did you have further questions? Sorry, I keep falling off the internet, so.
Jess has got one.
Great.
Yeah, so my next question would be, what obstacles and resistance should we expect to face from the establishment, and how would we dealing with those?
Brilliant.
So I didn't catch all of the questions. So what obstacles and objections should we expect from
the establishment, and how would we go about sort of dealing with those?
You want to go first, Clodagh, or shall I?
You go ahead, Graham.
So Jess and Rianka have just kind of like exposed every kind of like issue, you know, major design issue with citizens' assemblies. So the first thing to say is, and I'll say something which might be, I don't think it's controversial, but a lot of these deliberative processes have, those ones that have been effective, mostly, not always, mostly have been effective because they've been effective in areas that the government or the public authority wanted to see change happen. So there's been a sense in which we haven't really seen many of these deliberative processes be established where a government hasn't wanted to see it being established. Now, I think that when we start to talk about, particularly if we were to get what Extinction Rebellion is arguing, a citizens' assembly that is looking for radical and fast restructuring, then there would be huge obstacles, huge resistance from not just the political establishment, but also the economic elites, etc. You know, it'd be really challenging environment. The one thing that Extinction Rebellion has on its side, which is, you know, if there is agreement to do this and it is done badly, or it's manipulated, or it's co-opted by government, then Extinction Rebellion goes back on the streets. And that's actually been very rare for a social movement to be arguing this vociferously for a citizens' assembly and being very clear that it wants the specific assembly to be run by government in a specific way. Otherwise, we're going to carry on being on the street. So I suppose, you know, there will be huge obstacles, there will be huge resistance. I think the fact that people like you, the activists, are getting themselves clued up on what a good assembly looks like means that if an assembly is run and it is run badly and it is or it is undermined by the establishment, then I think we're all back on the streets again.
Yeah, I'm not certain I can actually add to that. I think that's, I mean, you're correct, Graham. I think Extinction Rebellion are in a really strong position compared to other groups on that issue. Certainly from my experience, my experience of these processes, they are still at, they operate, I suppose the agenda is still set by the political establishment. However, these processes, because the citizens buy into them, because actually the greatest advocates of these processes are those who participate in them. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. The greatest advocates of citizens' assemblies are actually assembly members and former assembly members, because even those who enter into it perhaps a little worried or a little skeptical usually come out the other side of it huge champions. And in many ways and I'm speaking I suppose about the Irish context here, but I would imagine there's no reason why it wouldn't happen elsewhere. I see it happening in France already. I follow a lot of the French Assembly, the French Citizens Assembly members, and they are advocating, they are very ardent advocates, not just of the process, but of the recommendations. And it's not just them, they become almost advocates within their communities too. So in a way, these assemblies create their own kind of activists within them looking for follow-up. But I mean, yes, there will always be those who are not keen to implement or do not see it in their interest to implement some of the recommendations that will come from these assemblies. And that's, you know, for example, even in the case of the Irish, the assembly that looked at climate action, the overwhelming majority of all those recommendations were accepted, but there was one kind of recommendation that caused, you know, that was always going to cause a headache, and that was around taxes on greenhouse gases on agriculture, because the farming sector is incredibly important to our economy. We're still quite a rural country. It's still, you know, in parts, the agricultural sector is quite important rurally too, and politically. So, you know, that's something that will still need pressure, but it's not. The activists in Ireland, you know, people aren't taking to the streets on it yet. There have obviously been those within Extinction Rebellion in Ireland who've taken to the streets as activists, but it's a challenge in the Irish context to put pressure on government to deliver on every recommendation. And when you know the answer, Jess, could you please send it to me? What are your own thoughts on it?
I would sort of say that, yeah, I think the establishment as we know it is always going to be against a citizens' assembly, but XR is very powerful in the current setting, so we've just got to sort of use, well, the powers in the people. So I think people have just got to use their own individual power to be that collective that does put that pressure, so that they have nowhere to turn and nowhere else to go but a citizens' assembly.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks.
Rianka, did you have further questions?
Can we not questions from the young people? They're too difficult.
Exactly. It's too late in the evening. They're excellent questions.
Yeah, we purposely asked them to come along and ask their questions.
Go for it.
Okay, my further two questions are a bit less intense. But so the current pandemic has shown meetings that have had to be moved online. Would the Citizens' Assembly be able to mobilise online?
Do you?
I can talk. Do you want to go first, Clodagh?
Very briefly, I mean, I think they have moved online, but I don't really have an awful lot to say on this, but they have in the UK, obviously, you've moved online, and also in France, they've moved online, and they seem to be, I know the UK one, it only happened the weekend before last. I didn't get a chance to observe how it went. I just followed it a little bit through Twitter. But from what I can see from the French experience, it seems to be working well. But I don't speak as an expert on online deliberation. I mean, I think most of us as human beings prefer to actually be dealing with one another face to face. But I think technology, as we can see, we're having this event and it's working by and large well. It's working very well, give or take some internet problems. So nothing, I suppose, beats the face to face kind of contact and the kind of conversations that might happen over tea and coffee and potential misunderstandings that might happen face to face, as opposed, online, that could be easily glossed over, smooth over face to face. But I think it would have been a shame to lose momentum. I think in these cases, it would have been a shame to lose momentum if you had to wait 4, 5, 6, maybe months. But again, I don't present myself as an expert on that. I think this is new ground in some ways, that a citizens' assembly that started off as a face-to-face assembly moves online. I know there has been experience and research on online deliberation, but I don't think, and Graham, you can correct me on this, if there have been those that have kind of literally moved halfway or towards the end of a process towards virtual deliberation, particularly for recommendations, which is usually the crucial point. Yeah. So
I think that what Clodagh says is right, and one of the things, it's difficult to draw too many lessons from the UK and the French assemblies having moved online. Or the French assemblies decided on its final weekend it's going to wait until after COVID because they actually want to meet face to face. But the UK one is finishing online. Remember, the UK one had 3 weekends face to face, and the French one 6 weekends face to face. So they were already used to working with each other. They built up rapport and they built up a kind of a way of working. I think technically there are ways of doing the things that citizens' assemblies do online. There are synchronous ways of engaging people in real time. There's ways of engaging people in, kind of asynchronous on message boards and things. And we could be very creative on using different online platforms to do that. The thing that really is important, I think, and what Clodagh's pointed to in citizens' assemblies, isn't the formal part is absolutely important, but just as important is the social time, the bumping into somebody in the corridor, the time you have over a cup of coffee to get to know somebody, the sharing of a dinner together, the having a drink in the bar or not having a drink in the bar, or going to do things with other people, going outside, going, bloody hell, that was hard work, wasn't it? Yeah, I found that, just that interaction. And although you can have that in, we've got a little chat room going and I can say something privately to somebody, that is not the same as sharing a cup of coffee. I was on a Zoom meeting the other day. It was a great meeting with Estonian activists and Estonian policymakers about their citizens' assembly on climate change that they want. And we did an hour and a half, and then we had a break for 15 minutes, and it was great. Someone put some music on and we could dance around, but I was on my own. I couldn't have a conversation with somebody else there. It just wasn't feasible. So I think there are some issues here. And there's one other issue I want to say is we need to think about, and that's the digital divide. And that isn't just that not everybody has access or not everybody has a computer, but it's also about the skills and the competence and the willingness to use online. So I think that there are certain things we can do online, but I think there are also things that we have face-to-face, which we would lose moving online. And I know that's going to be not controversial. I know there are people out there in the audience, because I know some of the people who are here, who think that we can do all this stuff online, but I would really like to see the way that we do the social stuff and and I actually think it's some of that social stuff that holds people in the process. So it's really nice to meet you over Zoom, but it would be so much nicer to hang out and kind of have a cup of tea together or something. You might think differently, I'm not sure.
It's an interesting one because we did do a webinar on digital tools for deliberative democracy last week, and yeah, there were loads of different outputs from that. You know, it increases accessibility in a way. For example, someone who can't leave their home, you know, that they can be online. But then obviously, you know, there isn't the face-to-face, and there's so many different aspects of that. So yeah, that's really really something to think about. I'm just going to go to some of our other platforms before I come back to Jess and Rianka again. So
you want to give us a couple of questions, 2 or 3 questions? Is that a good idea?
Good idea. So let me see. There is one. So we've got Gordon from Facebook. Has the English government already passed a law to say they will make a decision passed in a National Citizens Assembly law, or do we, before anything else, need to get that implemented? Or sorry, I'm not sure if I'm reading that correctly. So I'm guessing that's sort of about the decision power, or the you know, whether or not it's binding. And then we've got Oliver from Facebook saying, what are the challenges in making CAs work in our UK society where there is such a lack of local government? Are there more dangers of fixing or rigging outcomes in a landscape where we don't have the structures and governance in place? Shall I leave those two with you for now? Clodagh or Graham, who would like to take that one first?
I can make a stab at them, bearing in mind that I'm no expert on the UK governance system. My understanding, so to Gordon's question first, my understanding of the Assembly in the UK and the Climate Assembly is that the decisions are not, you know, it is that the recommendations go to the 6 steering committees that established the Assembly, and that yes, they will be discussed and hopefully they will have impact, but I suppose there's no guarantee that anything that comes from the Assembly will be implemented. But you would hope that when committees go to the trouble and effort of establishing something and resourcing it and asking for recommendations and report back, that at least there will be some responsiveness to it. But I suppose so that's the answer to that. Again, in terms of concerns about rigging, I think Graham had answered that already in his presentation when he said that, you know, the way in which there's recruitment to the Assembly, it's done obviously through sortition, through random selection. So that means the Assembly cannot be packed with people who are with vested interests. Again, a well-designed Assembly will make sure that those who are giving expert evidence are not those who are, I suppose, that there's balance, and that they're fact-based. In Ireland, assemblies have worked well, and we have incredibly weak local government. So I wouldn't see weak local government. I mean, I'm not a fan of weak local government. Democracy, I suppose, is most relevant to us at the local level. So I would always argue for stronger local democracy. But weak local government shouldn't negatively impact on a national citizens' assembly. Certainly it hasn't in the Irish context, although I say that as somebody who's an advocate for much stronger local government. Yeah. So that's my tuppence halfpenny.
Graham?
Yeah, so I won't add to the second one. I think I agree on what, well, I totally agree with what Clodagh said. If Gordon is thinking about if we were to have the kind of assembly that Extinction Rebellion is arguing for, rather than the assembly that's being run at the moment, as in an assembly that is fully empowered to make decisions on climate justice, etc. My sense even then is actually that the UK Parliament cannot bind itself in the same way that in Brexit, the UK Parliament had the final decision. It just decided that it would follow the Brexit vote. I think we'd have to have the same situation formally, at least formally, where the recommendations would be ratified by Parliament. That's my sense. On those things that were non-parliamentary, which didn't require legal change, then in that case, the government could bind itself. But there would be a sense in which the commitment, what Extinction Rebellion would be looking for, is a commitment from government and parliament to act on those recommendations that achieved a certain degree of support within the Assembly, with the proviso that if they didn't, then XR will be back on the streets again.
Just quickly leading on from that, Stefano on Zoom wanted to ask what was the output or the outcome of the Citizens' Assembly on Brexit, Graham?
Oh, gosh, that's a complete, yeah, I wasn't expecting that one. Okay, so the Citizens' Assembly on Brexit actually happened after the Brexit referendum. And the idea there was for us to look to take the referendum as given. So it wasn't asking people whether or not there should have been Brexit or not. It was asking people, what should we do now? And we focused on we only had 2 weekends. So we focused on 2 aspects. One was the economic relationship with the European Union. And the other was issues of what should our migration policy look like. And what was really interesting, and remember this was just after the referendum when the Conservative Party were talking about hard Brexit, was actually the favoured outcome economically was a bespoke deal with the European Union, both in terms of access to the single market and the customs union. Of course, that would be the outcome because that's the best of all possible worlds. And then we said, well, if you can't have that, would you prefer to have a hard Brexit? Or would you prefer to remain within the single market and the customs union? And the majority, and a significant majority of the Assembly, decided they wanted to would prefer to remain within the customs union and within the single market. What's interesting about that is that's a really lousy negotiation position, which is saying, give us a bespoke deal, and if you don't, we'll stay in the single market, we'll stay in the customs union. So it's an interesting thing where the Citizens' Assembly actually made it clear that it would like to see basically us stay reasonably close to the European Union and not go to a hard Brexit. And one of the reasons it didn't really have an impact was because it was at that very moment where the Conservative Party were charging on a kind of hard Brexit rhetoric. What is positive from my perspective as someone who organised that was the fact that we had 2 aims. One was to affect the Brexit debates, which we had almost no impact on whatsoever. But the second was to raise the profile of citizens' assemblies. And there is no question in my mind that if we hadn't had the Citizens' Assembly on Brexit, we wouldn't have had the Citizens' Assembly on social care, which was run by Involve, who we worked with. When we wouldn't, and I'm not quite sure we would be having I think almost certainly we wouldn't be having the UK Climate Assembly at the moment. Now, it's not what Extinction Rebellion wants, but what that shows is that you can, by doing this kind of experiment that we did, is actually build the capacity and build the nerve, if you like, within government and within Parliament to actually take these processes seriously. So all of the citizens' assemblies that have been run in the UK at the national level have been run by Parliament and not by government.
Thank you, Graham. Just a little bit of housekeeping. We were meant to finish at 8 o'clock. But obviously, because of our technical difficulties, we started 15 minutes late. So I was going to ask our panelists if they are okay to stay for another 15 minutes. I know that this is asking a lot. So Clodagh, I think you with a little one at home, you might need to scoot off. I just wanted to check with you.
I'm okay for another about 5 or 10 minutes, if that's okay, please. I don't know how long the bribery can last.
Okay. Thank you so much. We appreciate it so much. I think if it were up to us and all of the questions we are getting through, we would keep you here for many more hours, but we won't do that to you. Rianka also had to go, but she had a really excellent question, which I'm going to read out if you don't mind. So she said, we have an aging population, and by using sortition to accumulate a group of people representative of our population, how will the opinions of the youth be prioritized, as we are the ones who will live to see more of the effects of the climate and ecological catastrophe?
We've done this one when you were crashed out.
I'm so sorry. Oh no, I'm really interested to hear that, the answer to that. Okay, so sorry about that.
See the recording.
I will.
I don't know if Jess might have another question. I wasn't sure.
Yeah, so my final question was just really how well is the potential for this to sort of extend to maybe a global and international citizens assembly where we would decide on international laws, because as we know, the actions of the Western world can affect those in the global south as well.
So actually, Clodagh, you go first, because you're going to have to disappear.
I'm still going to hang around and listen to your response on this, because wow, Jess, that's an excellent question. That's a humdinger of a question. Wouldn't it be marvelous? One of my greatest concerns about the COVID-19 pandemic is that it's going to make us all more insular again, which is anyway. Yes, wouldn't it be fantastic? I mean, you'd imagine it's not beyond the bounds of our imaginations as human beings to extend this type of initiative beyond the nation state. And there have been efforts. I know, I'm thinking particularly of James Fishkin. He had the deliberative polling, which has a lot of the same principles as a citizens' assembly. They did that across the European Union. God, is it nearly 10 years ago now? And it was, it's some challenge when you consider all the different official languages and even just the logistics of bringing people together in one location. But it was done. It was done. So it can be done. And I think, this is why I have to listen to Graham's answer, because I know he's much more informed than me on this. Wasn't there a global citizens parliament? Was that run by John Dryzek, Graham, or have I entered the realm of hallucination through social isolation?
I think it was a proposal rather than an actual
proposal. Okay. But so I think I would like to think that as human beings we could do it, but a lot of our global institutions are themselves under-resourced and struggling and dealing with various factions. And I suppose those of us who are able to get on the streets and protest and indeed demand more democracy live actually in a very privileged position to be able to do that without actual threats to our personal safety in many ways. So, or the security of our families. So yes, but I wish I could say I would see it happening in the next 5 to 10 years, but I have grave concerns. We're heading into a period of perhaps entrenched nationalism. I hope not. I hope that this pandemic shows us how interconnected we are, how interdependent and indeed fragile we are. But I'm really keen to hear Graham's response.
I'll just add to what what Claude has just said about the EU level. So there have been experiments in the EU, and actually there's a really big pressure on the European institutions to have a citizens' assembly as part of the future of Europe, the Convention on the Future of Europe, which has been announced. And there's a lot of pressure groups, a lot of democracy groups all over Europe putting a lot of pressure on that. And I'm also very aware that there's a group within Extinction Rebellion who are acting on a European level, pushing for a UK climate assembly. What's interesting, I know from talking to people in that process, is the cultures of what's acceptable and what isn't acceptable in different countries is creating some issues. The other thing to point to is there was a project a few years ago called Worldwide Views, which was run by the Danish technology, I can't remember what their third
Danish Board of Technology.
Yeah, the Danish Board of Technology, thank you. And they did a global deliberation, but what they did is the deliberation happened in each country, and then they collated it all together. And that was kind of interesting, but it didn't really grapple with things. However, I have heard, and I only heard it as a whisper, and I won't say any more than this, that there are some activists within Extinction Rebellion, not just the UK Extinction Rebellion, but beyond, who are trying to put together a big project, a big demonstration project, which would be a big kind of exemplar of how deliberation could happen on a global level, which would be based in somewhere in the global south, that would be majority global south, because that's actually where the majority of the population is. Wouldn't it be amazing to see a political institution that was at international level that wasn't dominated by a few global north representatives? So there are people who are trying to do this as a demonstration project, but not, we're yet to see it as embedded in any of the global institutions. But let's hope that they have the courage, that someone finances them, and we actually get to see it, because I think it would be so exciting. It would be amazing. So thanks for could be a bit of a mess as well, but it should be exciting. What do you think, Jess?
Yeah, I agree. I think it'd be something that'd be amazing to see, but I'm not sure that it'd happen sort of in the current world that we live in. But I mean, I've sort of done a bit of work alongside the UN 75 group and Peace Child, and their sort of aim is to bring the youth together in what I would describe as sort of like a citizens' assembly. And I think that if the youth can do it and display that we can, then I think that just opens up the options that we have globally to do this.
I think our aim here isn't going to be on the global institutions. Like, we can't expect the UN or the World Bank or whatever to organise this. Actually, where we're more likely to see it is with a big media partner who was going to see this as something, you know, some sort of public broadcasting organisations around the world getting together and saying, we want to show that this can be done, part of a sort of you know, some sort of progressive alliance or whatever. But it, you know, this would, if I had a spare few million, this would be something I'd be interested in throwing it at, I must admit. But I'm a university lecturer, so I don't. Sorry.
And we've got two questions from YouTube as well. We've got, first of all, what is the timeline of the Citizens' Assembly? I assume that we're talking about just the Citizens' Assembly that XR is maybe demanding. So maybe Graham, you could take that one. And then another question from Druma on YouTube is, how do we make sure citizens' assemblies are not speciesist?
Oh, blimey. Go on, Clodagh.
Thank you, Graham. That's an excellent question, and I suppose what we can do is, again, make sure that there are those who can advocate for those of us who aren't humans. Again, I would look back to the way in which the whole thing is, you know, even the principles that a given assembly would work from the beginning of its work. But there are ways, I suppose, in terms of the expert testimony, the expert evidence, in terms of the remit, in terms of the lens, how assembly could from day one decide, well, listen, this is how we approach our work, and as we approach our work, we're conscious that we are not the only species on the planet, and again, through materials, through information, through expertise, actually, do you know what could be very interesting in this regard? And I say this now as somebody who probably is long overdue a coffee, so forgive me if this is absolutely absurd, but why not take the assembly out of the room and out into the wild, or out on, you know, into the field, out at sea, you know? I think that's one of the ways in which we could do it.
One of our colleagues in Australia, a guy called Simon Niemeyer, when his first citizens jury he ran was about a road project in the jungle in northern Queensland, I think it was. And they actually did go and do a day's deliberation, and kind of went and sat in the rainforest and looked at what would happen to the road. And that really actually did, what would happen to the jungle, that really did affect many people who are in that process. There have been really radical suggestions about, you know, people standing for particular parts of the ecosystem. I think it's incredibly challenging, because that's still a human projection of what that particular part of the ecosystem, of that particular element of the natural, of the non-human world. But yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of techniques which we should use. There's all sorts of artistic ways of doing this. There's all sorts of really interesting practices. We tend to think of these things as very dry processes in rooms, and there's no reason why they should be. There's no reason why they shouldn't take place in all sorts of interesting environments, and that people should be put through all sorts of, taken to interesting places to broaden their perspective. So I think that's a really interesting development. In terms of timeline, you could set something up like this within between 3 to 6 months, but you would need to have the political will there for it to happen. If you've got significant interests who are against it and are trying to block it, then that causes problems. But if you've got an alignment of forces such that this is something that the government agrees to do, then I think we could be up and running within 3 to 6 months. Only if you paid me to do it, of course.
Yeah. Thanks, Graham. We'll keep that in mind. Okay, Clodagh, I don't know if you want to, you want to shoot off, don't you? Yeah.
I'm really sorry. Thank you so much, everybody.
It was brilliant. And as you can see, people just want more and more of you. So maybe we should have another one at some stage. Without all the tech problems.
Thank you for everything. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Take care, Clodagh.
Bye. Thank you, Graham. Mind yourself. Take care. Take care. Bye-bye, everybody. Mind yourselves. Take care. Bye.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm aware, Graham, that we're running out of time.
That's okay. Just to say, in citizens' assemblies, this often happens when, for example, a witness generates particular loads and loads of questions and things. What we would often do in an assembly is we would actually offline get those people to answer those questions and then bring that back to the assembly. So that could be done through video, it could be done through writing responses. So in the spirit of democratic engagement, I would be willing, and I'm sure Clodagh would be willing, to sort of respond in whatever format seemed work. I mean, not necessarily creating another Zoom call, but perhaps creating some sort of document where we could just briefly respond to those questions.
That would be amazing. I'm seeing lots of positive responses to that. So let me try, or let us try and collate those questions for you. And we'll. Are you happy to take one more question, or
yeah, sure,
it's 1:15 now? Should we have a final?
Sure. I think the strange thing that's happening here, Marianne, is I'm never seeing my picture. Does my picture never appear? I'm not quite sure why. All the way through this, it's very weird.
Oh no, I can see you. We can all see you.
So I can't see myself when I'm speaking. That's really interesting.
No, we can definitely see you.
And I only do this to see myself, Yeah.
I actually find it really distracting because you end up looking at yourself like some kind of narcissist. Like, it's weird. But
I've had more years than you have practice of being a narcissist, so you're fine.
No, we can see you, Graham, so don't worry. Yeah, looking good. Okay, so behind the scenes, we have a WhatsApp chat trying to collate all your wonderful questions. I just want to say to everyone who's watching this, sending in questions, thank you so much. And we are not going to be able to answer all of them right now, but Graham's just generously offered to try and answer some of them. So I'm lost, guys. I don't know which question to ask now. I am going to go to.
Can I just say I'll answer one which I think are Jess might appreciate, but certainly I think Rianka someone said, isn't it enough that will be parents within these assemblies? Someone said this earlier in response to the question that was asked. And actually the data shows that parents aren't, just by having a children, aren't necessarily more future regarding and acting on the interests of their children. You'd think they would, but actually the evidence is not, the psychological evidence isn't there, I'm afraid. So you can't rely on your parents. You've got to do it yourself.
and
I got a nod from Rianka there, so there we go.
That's brilliant. Rianka or Jess, did you want to ask one final question, one of you, and then we'll let Paul Graham go and have a coffee or a glass of wine or whatever. Oh, Rianka?
Yeah, my final question was, who would commission the assembly and how will they be selected in order to ensure that they're fair?
Why not? Yeah, why not end with a really difficult question? So usually what happens is that the assembly is commissioned by public authority, in the sense like they say that this assembly is going to happen, and it doesn't need to be the commissioning body that sets the question. What they might say is, this is what we would like to, the broad area would like to see. You can then create an advisory group which includes all the different interests that were involved in the issue to try and agree what that question might be. My sense is that that could be just a bun fight and really difficult to manage. But the guy from Poland, Marcin Gerwin, has actually had this idea where he says what we should do is we should actually have a separate group of randomly selected citizens who actually oversee what the question will be and actually have to be persuaded that this is the right question. I think that's it's quite an interesting and neat solution. I don't think you do random selection for everything, but that might be quite a neat solution. It's certainly the solution that I mentioned before that's happening in Belgium, where it's a group of citizens who are making the final decision as to what a citizens' assembly should be. In many ways, though, you know, if we're coming from an Extinction Rebellion perspective, it's quite clear what Extinction Rebellion expects the question to be. It's not that Extinction Rebellion are looking for the government to accept that question, and that question is, you know, how do we get to net zero and ensure protection of biodiversity? I'm not articulating this well, by 2025, or for other people 2030. So there is a sense in which Extinction Rebellion is bringing a question to bear. I guess one could test that question against a group of randomly selected citizens, or you could just argue that we want to see it on Extinction Rebellion's terms. I mean, it's an interesting question.
Thank you, Graham. I think we're going to let you go now. But yeah, as I said, we could.
Can I eat my cake now?
Yes. Oh my God, that looks amazing.
I made it 3 days ago. It's a bit dry, but it's all right.
Oh, it's still, well, it looks amazing from our end. So
that's because none of you have been able to eat for the last 2 hours. That's
sorry about that. We've kept you busy at least.
Yeah, it's been great.
I just want to say, Graham, thank you so much for being here this evening, giving up your Monday evening to be with us, and I really want to say thank you so much as well to all the people who have attended the Zoom call, everybody on all the live streams. You know, we've got people from all over the world at all sorts of crazy hours of the day and night, you know, staying up late or waking up early to tune in to watch this. So yeah, thank you so much. And of course, thank you so much to Jess and to Rianka for being here and for your awesome questions. You guys are amazing. And yeah, please come back soon, and next time we'll just let you run the webinar because you did an amazing job. So thank you, and of course thank you to everyone behind the scenes collating the questions. Thank you so much to Christian from Media Messaging in XR for helping us with the live streaming, and many apologies for the horrible technical difficulties we've been having tonight. But yeah, it just makes you realize how much we rely on the internet. So yes, thank you so much, everybody. Have a lovely rest of your evening or morning or afternoon, wherever you are in the world. And yeah, you will be able to watch this back on YouTube. And if you have any questions, you can email us. It's xr-citizensassembly protonmail.com. I'm just reading it off my post-it. Or you can tweet us at citizensxr as well. And that's the specific Twitter and Facebook for the Citizens Assembly Working Group. So anything about Citizens Assembly will come to us and we will try and answer your questions. And also we've created a little website as well with lots of information about Citizens Assemblies, which is xrcitizensassembly.uk. And also I'm just being told about our Telegram channel, which you can join, which I won't read out, but it's Telegram/Citizens Assemblies. You can find us on there. And I think that's enough information for the night. Any further questions, please just get in touch. And yeah, we will post out once we've managed to collate some of the questions that we weren't able to answer tonight, and get you some answers for that. So from all of us at the Citizens Assembly Working Group at XR UK, good night and thank you so much. And thank you, Graham. Thanks, bye.
Thanks so much for watching with our amazing panelists, and to our hosts, and to all the people who work at the XR Citizens Assembly Working. Sorry if you experienced any technical issues during tonight's live stream. Rest assured we are having words with the internet. As ever, head to rebellion.earth for more info on what Extinction Rebellion are getting up to, or visit xrcitizensassembly.uk for more information about the Citizens Assembly. Have a lovely evening.